The blizzard had been raging for 3 days when Grey Wolf found her. Half buried in snow beneath a twisted pine, the pale woman lay motionless. Her lips blue with cold and her breathing so shallow it barely misted in the frozen air. Most warriors would have left her to the mercy of the mountain spirits, but something about her stillness called to him. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. Her golden hair spilled over his buckskin sleeve like captured sunlight, and beneath the frost on her lashes, he glimpsed eyes the color of summer sky. She was white, which meant trouble for them both, but Grey Wolf had never been one to abandon the helpless to winter's cruel embrace. As he carried her toward his shelter, one question burned in his mind. What had driven this fragile eastern woman into Apache territory during the most dangerous season of the year? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Grey Wolf's shelter nestled against a rocky outcropping, hidden from the wind by thick pine boughs and a carefully constructed windbreak of stones and branches. He had built it during his vision quest 3 winters ago, when the mountain spirits had called him to seek wisdom in solitude. Now it would serve a different purpose entirely. He laid the unconscious woman on his sleeping furs, noting the way her skin felt like winter ice beneath his calloused hands. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps that spoke of a body fighting desperately against the cold's final embrace. Grey Wolf had seen men die from such exposure before, had watched strong warriors succumb to winter's merciless grip, but something about this woman's face, peaceful despite her suffering, stirred an unfamiliar protectiveness within him. From the medicine pouch at his belt, he withdrew the sacred stones his grandfather had given him before the old man's journey to the spirit world. The smooth obsidian and turquoise pieces had been passed down through 5 generations of healers, each stone carrying the wisdom of those who had used them to mend both body and spirit. Grey Wolf arranged them in the traditional pattern around the woman's still form, speaking the ancient words his grandfather had taught him. The healing ritual required more than ceremony. Grey Wolf built up the fire until flames danced high against the shelter's walls, then began the careful process of warming her body. He removed her ice-stiffened clothing, a torn dress of fine fabric that spoke of wealth and Eastern refinement, woolen stockings with delicate embroidery, and leather boots made for city streets rather than mountain trails. Each garment told a story of a life far removed from this harsh wilderness. As he wrapped her in warm furs and positioned her near the fire, Grey Wolf studied her face more closely. She possessed a refined beauty that marked her as gently bred, with high cheekbones and a straight nose that suggested aristocratic lineage. Her hands, though scratched and frozen, showed no calluses from hard labor. This was no frontier woman accustomed to hardship, but someone raised in comfort and protection. What had driven such a woman into the mountains alone, in winter, wearing only a torn dress? The storm outside continued its assault on the shelter, wind howling through the pines like the voices of angry spirits. Grey Wolf tended the fire and checked on his unexpected patient throughout the long night, applying heated stones wrapped in soft deerskin to her extremities and monitoring her breathing. Twice her life seemed to flicker like a candle flame in the wind, and twice he called upon his grandfather's healing knowledge to pull her back from the spirit world's threshold. Near dawn, when the wind finally began to quiet, the woman stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the deep blue of mountain lakes in summer. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze as she tried to understand where she was and how she had come to be there. Then memory returned, and with it, fear. She tried to sit up, gasping as movement sent pain through her frost-damaged limbs. Grey Wolf moved quickly to steady her, speaking in low, soothing tones though he doubted she understood his words. Her eyes darted around the shelter, taking in the Apache weapons hanging from the walls, the traditional designs painted on his clothing, the unmistakable evidence that she was in the care of the very people her kind had been taught to fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't hurt me." The words were in English, confirming Grey Wolf's suspicion about her origins. He had learned some of the white man's language from traders who occasionally ventured into Apache territory, though he spoke it poorly. Still, he understood her fear and wanted to ease it. Safe, he said carefully, the English word feeling awkward on his tongue. You safe here? She studied his face, searching for deception or threat. What she found instead was genuine concern and a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything she had been told about Apache warriors. Grey Wolf could see the moment when exhaustion overcame fear, when her body's need for rest conquered her mind's protests. My name, she said softly, is Elizabeth. Grey Wolf, he replied, touching his chest. Then, seeing her shiver despite the fire's warmth, he added more fuel to the flames and adjusted the furs around her. As Elizabeth drifted back into healing sleep, Grey Wolf contemplated the complications her presence would bring. To help a white woman was dangerous enough, but to harbor her in his shelter, to care for her as he would his own sister, violated every teaching about keeping the two worlds separate. His people had learned through bitter experience that kindness toward whites was rarely rewarded with anything but betrayal and death. Yet as he watched her sleep, noting the way peace smoothed the worry lines from her face, Grey Wolf knew he could not have left her to die in the snow. The mountain spirits had placed her in his path for a reason, and he would trust their wisdom even if it led to his own destruction. Outside, the storm finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. Inside the shelter, two people from different worlds began a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the possibility of finding home in the most unexpected places. Elizabeth awakened to the scent of pine smoke and something cooking over the fire. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the shelter's walls, creating dancing patterns of light and shadow that reminded her of the stained glass windows in her father's church back in Boston. The memory brought a sharp pang of homesickness that she quickly pushed aside. There was no going back to that life now. Grey Wolf sat cross-legged beside the fire, stirring something in a metal pot that looked suspiciously like army surplus. He had traded with soldiers before, she realized, which meant he wasn't the savage her governess had described in whispered warnings about the Western territories. When he noticed her watching, he offered a smile that transformed his stern features into something almost boyish. Hungry? He asked in careful English, ladling steaming broth into a wooden bowl. Elizabeth tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Every muscle in her body protested the movement, and her hands and feet burned with the peculiar fire of returning circulation. Grey Wolf moved quickly to help her, his touch gentle but sure as he positioned furs behind her back for support. The broth tasted of herbs and venison, warming her from the inside out. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. Grey Wolf watched her eat with satisfaction, occasionally adding wood to the fire or adjusting her coverings with the attentiveness of someone accustomed to caring for the sick. "Thank you," Elizabeth said when she had finished half the bowl. The words seemed inadequate for someone who had saved her life, but they were all she had. Grey Wolf nodded, then pointed to himself and spoke slowly. "Grey Wolf, Apache." He pointed to her. "Elizabeth, white woman." She understood he was trying to bridge the language barrier between them. "Boston," she said, touching her chest. "I come from Boston." His brow furrowed as he tried to place the name. "Boston far." "Very far," she confirmed. "Many days' travel." This seemed to puzzle him even more. What was a woman from the distant east doing alone in Apache territory, especially in winter? Elizabeth saw the questions in his dark eyes, but wasn't ready to answer them. The memories were still too raw, too painful to examine closely. Instead, she gestured to the torn fabric of her dress, which Grey Wolf had carefully arranged near the fire to dry. The sight of it brought back everything she was trying to forget: the forced engagement to a man she despised, the elaborate wedding preparations that felt like planning her own funeral, and finally her desperate escape into the night. "Wedding dress," she said simply, seeing understanding dawn in Grey Wolf's eyes. He studied the fine silk and intricate beadwork with new interest. This wasn't just any dress but a garment that represented significant wealth and social standing. The woman he had rescued wasn't merely well-born but belonged to the very highest levels of Eastern society. "You run away?" he asked, his English carefully chosen. Elizabeth nodded, feeling tears threaten. I couldn't marry him. He was cruel and my father wouldn't listen. So I ran. Gray Wolf absorbed this information quietly. In Apache culture, marriages were matters of family negotiation, but a woman's consent was considered essential. The idea of forcing an unwilling woman into marriage was foreign to his understanding of proper behavior. "This man follow you?" The question sent a chill through Elizabeth that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Captain Morrison would indeed follow her, not out of love but out of wounded pride and the substantial dowry that would disappear with her. Her father's business connections and political influence would ensure that every resource was brought to bear on finding her. "Yes," she whispered. "He will come." Gray Wolf's expression hardened. "Here you safe. Apache territory. White soldiers not welcome." Elizabeth wanted to believe him, but she knew Morrison's reputation for ruthless determination. He had made his name fighting Indians on the frontier, earning promotions through brutality that even his fellow officers found excessive. If anyone could track her into Apache lands, it would be him. As if sensing her doubts, Gray Wolf rose and retrieved something from the far corner of the shelter. He returned with a garment of soft deerskin, decorated with intricate beadwork in blue and silver patterns that seemed to capture and reflect the firelight. "For you," he said, offering the dress. "Warm. Better than torn cloth." Elizabeth accepted the gift with wonder. The deerskin was incredibly soft, worked to a suppleness that rivaled the finest silk. The beadwork showed hours of patient labor, each tiny piece carefully placed to create flowing designs that reminded her of water and wind. "Did you make this?" she asked. Gray Wolf shook his head, pointing upward. "Mother, in spirit world now." Elizabeth understood that he was offering her something precious, a garment that had belonged to his deceased mother. The gesture moved her more than any expensive gift she had ever received. "I can't take this," she protested. "It's too valuable." "You need," Gray Wolf said simply. She would want to help woman in trouble. As Elizabeth held the dress against herself, she felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since her desperate flight from Boston, she felt truly safe. Not just physically protected, but welcomed and cared for in a way that had nothing to do with her father's wealth or social position. Gray Wolf had seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen kindness over suspicion. Now she would have to decide whether she could trust him with the full truth of why she was running and what it might cost them both. The deerskin dress fit Elizabeth as if it had been made for her, its soft warmth a stark contrast to the restrictive corsets and heavy fabrics of her former life. As she helped Gray Wolf with the daily tasks of survival, gathering wood, preparing food, maintaining the fire, she began to understand the rhythm of life in the wilderness. Everything had purpose, nothing was wasted, and each action connected to the next in an endless cycle of practical necessity. Gray Wolf moved through these tasks with fluid efficiency, but Elizabeth noticed he often paused in his work to carve something from a piece of pale wood. His knife moved with practiced precision, creating curves and hollows that gradually revealed the shape of a flute. She watched him work during the quiet evening hours, fascinated by the way his large hands could create something so delicate. "Music?" she asked, pointing to the emerging instrument. Gray Wolf nodded, testing one of the finger holes with his breath. A clear, sweet note emerged, echoing softly in the confined space of the shelter. He smiled at her expression of delight and continued his work, explaining in a mixture of Apache and broken English how the wood had come from a tree struck by lightning, making it sacred to his people. "Lightning would sing true," he said, holding up the flute. "Grandfather teach me. Music speak when words cannot." Elizabeth understood more than he realized. Music had been her refuge in Boston, the one pursuit her father allowed that brought her genuine joy. She had played piano since childhood, finding in melody and harmony an escape from the rigid expectations of her social class. "I play music too," she said, miming piano keys. "Big instrument. Many keys." Gray Wolf's eyes lit with interest. "You play for me?" Elizabeth laughed, the sound surprising them both with its lightness. "No piano here, only mountains." "Then you learn new music," Gray Wolf said. offering her the flute. She accepted it carefully, noting the smoothness of the wood and the precise placement of the holes. When she brought it to her lips and blew gently, a clear tone emerged that seemed to harmonize with the wind outside their shelter. Grey Wolf showed her how to place her fingers, how to control her breath, how to coax different notes from the simple instrument. His hands covered hers as he guided her movements, and Elizabeth felt something spark between them that had nothing to do with music instruction. His touch was warm and calloused from years of outdoor work, so different from the soft hands of the Eastern gentleman she had known. As the evening progressed, Elizabeth managed to produce a simple melody, halting and uncertain but recognizably musical. Grey Wolf listened with the intensity of someone hearing something precious and rare. When she finished, he picked up his own flute, an older instrument, well worn from years of use, and played the same melody back to her, but with variations that made it soar and dance like bird song. "Beautiful," Elizabeth whispered, and Grey Wolf understood she meant more than just the music. They played together as the fire burned lower, taking turns with melodies, teaching each other fragments of songs from their different worlds. Elizabeth found herself humming airs from Bach and Mozart, which Grey Wolf transformed into something wild and free when he played them back. He shared Apache melodies that spoke of wind and water, of animals moving through forest shadows, of the eternal conversation between earth and sky. Through music, they discovered a language that needed no translation. Elizabeth began to understand why Grey Wolf had seemed so different from the savage warriors described in her governess's frightening stories. There was poetry in his soul, a connection to beauty and harmony that spoke of depths her sheltered upbringing had never allowed her to imagine in an Apache warrior. "Why do you live alone?" she asked during a quiet moment between songs. Grey Wolf set down his flute and gazed into the fire. "I seek vision. Grandfather say mountain spirits have message for me. But vision not come yet. How long have you waited? 3 winters. Maybe spirits wait for right time." Elizabeth studied his profile in the firelight, noting the patience in his expression. In her world, waiting 3 days for anything was considered excessive. The idea of spending 3 years in solitude, listening for spiritual guidance, seemed both foreign and oddly appealing. "Maybe," she said softly, "the spirits were waiting for me to arrive." Grey Wolf turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of connection that went beyond language or cultural differences. Elizabeth felt her heart quicken as she realized she was beginning to care for this man in ways that would have shocked her Boston society friends. "Elizabeth," Grey Wolf said her name carefully, as if testing its weight. "You bring music to my heart." The simple words carried more meaning than any flowery declaration she had ever heard from Eastern suitors. As they prepared for sleep, Elizabeth found herself looking forward to tomorrow's lessons, to discovering what other surprises this remarkable man might have to share. Outside, the wind carried the distant howl of wolves, but inside their shelter, surrounded by the warmth of fire and the echo of shared melodies, Elizabeth felt safer than she had ever felt in her father's Boston mansion. As Elizabeth grew stronger, Grey Wolf began sharing stories of his past, often triggered by objects in his shelter that held deep personal meaning. One evening, as she helped him repair a torn piece of gear, he pulled a tarnished military badge from a leather pouch, handling it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. "My father," Grey Wolf said simply, placing the badge in Elizabeth's palm. The metal felt cold and heavy, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. Elizabeth could make out the emblem of the U.S. Cavalry, though the details were obscured by age and wear. She looked up at Grey Wolf with confusion, wondering why an Apache warrior would treasure a symbol of the military force that had been his people's enemy. "He was soldier?" she asked carefully. Grey Wolf's expression darkened with old pain. "No. He take this from soldier who kill my mother." The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. She had grown up hearing sanitized stories of frontier conflicts, tales that painted soldiers as noble protectors of civilization against savage attacks. The idea that this badge represented a personal tragedy for Grey Wolf forced her to confront the possibility that everything she had been taught about the Indian Wars was incomplete at best. "Tell me," she said softly, settling beside him near the fire. Gray Wolf stared into the flames for a long moment before speaking. I was boy, maybe 12 winters. Cavalry come to our village in spring. They say we steal horses, kill settlers. But we had peaceful winter, hunt only for food, trade with Mexican merchants. His voice carried the flat tone of someone recounting events too painful for emotion. Elizabeth listened without interruption, recognizing the weight of trust he was placing in her by sharing this story. Soldiers not want to hear truth. They come at dawn when people sleep, fire arrows into lodges, shoot women, children who try to run. Gray Wolf's hands clenched around the badge. My mother carry my baby sister. Soldier shoot them both. Elizabeth felt tears sting her eyes. Oh, Gray Wolf, I'm so sorry. My father very brave warrior. He fight 3 soldiers with only knife. Kill one, wound another, but third one shoot him in back. Gray Wolf held up the badge. This belonged to soldier my father kill. I take it from his body. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of history and loss. Elizabeth understood now why Gray Wolf had hesitated to help her, why harboring a white woman represented such a risk for him. Her very presence in his shelter was an act of extraordinary trust given what her people had done to his family. Why did you save me? She asked, needing to understand. Gray Wolf studied her face in the firelight. Grandfather teach me that hatred poison the heart. He say my father's spirit would be ashamed if I become like the soldiers who kill for fear. Elizabeth reached out tentatively and covered his hand with hers. The gesture was bold by the standards of her upbringing, but the wilderness had stripped away many of her Eastern inhibitions. Not all white people are like those soldiers, she said. I know this now, Gray Wolf replied, his eyes meeting hers. You show me. The moment stretched between them, charged with an awareness that went beyond cultural differences or shared trauma. Elizabeth felt herself drawn to this man who had suffered so much yet chosen compassion over revenge. His strength wasn't the brutal domination she had seen in Captain Morrison, but something deeper and more enduring. I want to understand your world, she said. Will you teach me? Gray Wolf nodded slowly. And you teach me yours. Maybe we find new way between Apache path and white man's road. Over the following days, Gray Wolf shared more of his heritage with Elizabeth. He taught her to read signs in the forest, broken twigs that spoke of passing animals, cloud formations that predicted weather changes, the subtle sounds that meant safety or danger. She learned to move quietly through the woods, to find edible plants, to prepare hides for clothing. In return, Elizabeth shared her own knowledge. Gray Wolf was instantly alert, his hand moving to his rifle as he motioned for Elizabeth to stay low. Through gaps in the shelter's walls, they could see 4 Apache warriors on horseback, their faces painted for war, weapons ready for battle. Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the danger. These were not the gentle, wise people Gray Wolf had described in his stories, but fierce fighters whose expressions promised violence for anyone who crossed them. Gray Wolf stepped outside to meet them, speaking rapidly in Apache while gesturing toward the shelter. The lead warrior, a man with silver streaking his braided hair and scars marking his weathered face, dismounted and approached Gray Wolf with obvious anger. Elizabeth couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. She caught her own name mentioned several times, along with what sounded like accusations and demands. Gray Wolf's responses grew more heated as the confrontation continued. Elizabeth saw him gesture toward the forest, then back to his shelter, his stance becoming more defensive with each exchange. The other warriors remained mounted but shifted their horses restlessly, hands never far from their weapons. Finally, the scarred warrior pushed past Gray Wolf and entered the shelter. Elizabeth pressed herself against the far wall as he studied her with cold, calculating eyes. When he spoke, his English was better than Gray Wolf's but laden with contempt. You are the white woman who brings soldiers to our land. I haven't brought anyone, Elizabeth protested. I came alone. The warrior's laugh held no humor. White woman never alone. Always soldiers follow, always bring death to Apache people. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his belt and thrust it toward her. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice as she recognized her own face drawn in careful detail, along with text offering a substantial reward for information leading to her capture. The wanted poster bore Captain Morrison's official seal and promised amnesty for any Indian who provided information about her whereabouts. "Your man offers much money for you," the warrior said. "Enough to buy many rifles, much ammunition. Tell me why Apache should not take you to soldiers." Elizabeth looked desperately toward Grey Wolf, who was translating for the other warriors. She could see the doubt creeping into their expressions as they learned about the reward. To them, she wasn't a woman seeking refuge but a valuable commodity that could strengthen their people's defenses. "Because I can help you," Elizabeth said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I know things about the soldiers, about their plans." The scarred warrior's eyes narrowed with interest. "What things?" Elizabeth's mind raced, searching for information that might save her life. She thought of the conversations she had overheard at military social functions in Boston, the casual discussions of Indian policy that had seemed so remote and abstract at the time. "The cavalry is planning a winter campaign," she said. "They want to force all Apache onto reservations before spring. Captain Morrison commands 3 companies, but more soldiers come from Fort Apache." Grey Wolf translated quickly, and Elizabeth saw the other warriors exchange worried glances. This was clearly news to them, information that could mean the difference between survival and destruction for their people. "How do you know this?" the scarred warrior demanded. "Captain Morrison was to be my husband," Elizabeth admitted. "He spoke freely about military matters, thinking I was too foolish to understand." The revelation changed the dynamic immediately. The warriors began talking rapidly among themselves, their anger toward Elizabeth shifting into something more complex. She was no longer simply a liability but a potential source of intelligence about their enemies. Grey Wolf stepped forward and spoke at length to the group, his tone respectful but firm. Elizabeth caught enough words to understand he was defending his decision to help her, arguing that she had proven her trustworthiness through her actions and attitude. The scarred warrior listened carefully, then turned back to Elizabeth. "You say you help Apache people. You willing to prove this?" "How?" Elizabeth asked, though she suspected she might not like the answer. "Warriors in our band are wounded. You have white woman's medicine knowledge." Elizabeth thought of her limited experience with nursing, gained through charitable work with Boston's poor. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to demonstrate her value to these suspicious men. "I know some healing," she said carefully. "I can try to help." The warriors conferred again, their debate growing heated. Elizabeth could see Grey Wolf arguing passionately on her behalf, his gestures becoming more emphatic as the discussion continued. Finally, the scarred warrior raised his hand for silence. "You come with us," he decided. "Heal our wounded. If you help Apache people, maybe Apache people help you. If you fail or if you try to escape, we take you to soldiers ourselves." Elizabeth nodded. Understanding this was the best offer she was likely to receive. As the warriors prepared to leave, Grey Wolf approached her with obvious concern. "You not have to do this," he said quietly. "I can protect you here." "Against your own people?" Elizabeth asked. "That would only bring more trouble for you." She saw the pain in his eyes as he realized she was right. By agreeing to help the wounded warriors, she was potentially saving Grey Wolf from having to choose between his loyalty to his people and his feelings for her. The Apache camp nestled in a hidden canyon, its lodges arranged in careful patterns that spoke of generations of tradition and tactical wisdom. Elizabeth rode behind Grey Wolf, acutely aware of the suspicious glances from women and children who emerged to watch their arrival. She had never felt so conspicuous, so obviously out of place, as when the scarred warrior, whose name she learned was Stone Bear, led them to a lodge where the wounded waited. Inside the dim interior, Elizabeth found 3 Apache warriors in various stages of injury. The worst was a young man with a bullet wound in his shoulder that had festered despite treatment with traditional medicines. His fever burned so high that he drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally calling out in delirium. Elizabeth knelt beside him, gently examining the infected wound while Grey Wolf translated her questions. The bullet was still lodged deep in the muscle, and green pus indicated serious infection. Without proper surgical tools and antibiotics, the young warrior would likely die within days. "I need clean water, sharp knives, and strong spirits," she said to Stone Bear, who watched her every movement with calculating eyes. "You can remove bullet?" he asked. "I can try, but I'll need help, and the patient must be held very still." As Elizabeth worked, she became aware of a growing crowd outside the lodge. Word of the white woman treating Apache wounded had spread through the camp, drawing curious onlookers who whispered among themselves about this unprecedented situation. Some voices carried anger, others curiosity, but all reflected the tension of a people forced to trust someone they had every reason to fear. Elizabeth began by cleaning the wound with boiled water, fighting against years of infection and neglect. The young warrior writhed in pain despite the strong hands holding him down, his cries echoing through the lodge. Elizabeth's own hands shook as she worked, knowing that failure would mean not only this man's death but likely her own as well. As she carefully probed for the bullet with a knife blade heated red-hot over the fire, Elizabeth found herself thinking of her grandmother's journal, a leather-bound book she had treasured since childhood. The old woman had been a nurse during the war between the states, tending wounded soldiers from both sides with equal compassion. Her detailed notes about battlefield surgery had seemed like distant history when Elizabeth read them as a girl, but now those carefully recorded techniques might save a life. "Hold him steady," she murmured, feeling the knife tip contact metal. "I think I can reach it." The bullet came free with a gush of infected blood and pus, followed immediately by cleaner bleeding that suggested healthy tissue beneath. Elizabeth quickly packed the wound with clean cloth and began the delicate process of stitching it closed with sinew thread provided by one of the Apache women. As she worked, Elizabeth became aware that Grey Wolf was describing her actions to the gathered crowd, explaining each step in terms that connected her medical knowledge to traditional Apache healing practices. She heard him mention her grandmother's wisdom and realized he was helping her establish credibility with people who had little reason to trust white medicine. The young warrior's fever broke the next morning, and Elizabeth felt a surge of relief that surprised her with its intensity. She had saved a life, but more than that, she had proven herself useful to people who desperately needed reasons to trust her. Over the following days, Elizabeth treated the other wounded warriors and began to notice subtle changes in how the Apache people regarded her. Women began approaching her with questions about treating their children's ailments. Men who had initially avoided eye contact started nodding respectfully when they passed. Children, always quick to adapt, began following her around the camp with open curiosity. Elizabeth found herself keeping notes about Apache medicinal plants and healing techniques in the margins of her grandmother's journal, creating a bridge between two medical traditions. The journal became a symbol of the knowledge exchange taking place, Elizabeth learning from Apache healers while sharing techniques from her own background. "You write about us?" asked an elderly Apache woman named Bright Moon, who had become Elizabeth's most valuable teacher in the use of local healing plants. "I write to remember," Elizabeth explained. "Your people know medicines my people have forgotten." Bright Moon smiled, the first truly warm expression Elizabeth had received from any Apache woman. "Then you write true things, not lies like other white people tell." The comment reminded Elizabeth of the vast gulf between her current experience and everything she had been taught about Apache people. These were not the savage, bloodthirsty warriors of frontier legends, but complex individuals with rich spiritual lives and sophisticated understanding of their environment. Grey Wolf found her that evening as she sat outside the lodge, writing by firelight. "You make good medicine," he said, settling beside her. "People begin to trust you." "They still watch me carefully," Elizabeth observed. "Of course, but now they watch to learn, not just to judge." Elizabeth looked around the camp, noting how the evening routine continued around them with barely a glance in their direction. For the first time since arriving, she felt less like a dangerous intruder and more like a welcomed guest. "Grey Wolf," she said softly, I think I'm beginning to understand why you choose to live with your people rather than alone in the mountains. And I begin to understand why white woman might choose to leave her people's world, he replied, his meaning clear even through the careful language they still use to navigate their growing feelings for each other. Elizabeth's acceptance into the Apache community grew stronger with each passing day, but it was her attempt to create something meaningful with her own hands that truly marked her transformation. Bright Moon had been teaching her the intricate art of beadwork, showing her how to select colors and patterns that told stories of the natural world around them. Working by firelight in the evenings, Elizabeth struggled to master the tiny glass beads that seemed to slip through her fingers like water. Her first attempts produced crooked lines and uneven patterns that bore little resemblance to the flowing designs Bright Moon created effortlessly. But Elizabeth persisted, driven by a desire to give something back to the people who had shown her unexpected kindness. Patience, Bright Moon counseled, watching Elizabeth's frustrated attempts to thread a particularly stubborn bead. Beadwork, like healing, cannot rush the process. Elizabeth nodded, forcing herself to slow down and focus on each individual stitch. She was creating a bracelet for Grey Wolf, using blue beads the color of deep water and silver ones that caught light like moonbeams on snow. The pattern represented flowing water, a design Bright Moon had suggested because of Grey Wolf's connection to the mountain streams that had guided him during his vision quest. As her fingers grew more nimble and her understanding of the craft deepened, Elizabeth found herself thinking about the women who had created the intricate beadwork on Grey Wolf's clothing and weapons. Each piece represented hours of patient labor, but also deep affection for the person who would wear it. In her former life, expressions of caring had been limited to purchasing expensive gifts made by others. Here, love was measured in time and personal effort. "Tell me about Grey Wolf as a boy," Elizabeth asked Bright Moon one evening as they worked side by side. The older woman's weathered face softened with memory. "Always serious child. After soldiers kill his family, he come to live with my sister's family. Very quiet, very angry. But grandfather see something special in him." "What kind of special?" "Grandfather say Grey Wolf have gift for healing, but first he must heal himself. That why he go to mountains alone, to find peace with past." Elizabeth absorbed this information, understanding now why Grey Wolf's decision to help her had been so significant. By choosing compassion over hatred, he had completed a healing journey that began in childhood trauma. "And you think he has found that peace?" Elizabeth asked. Bright Moon studied her with knowing eyes. "I think white woman help him find it. Question is whether white woman find her own peace." The observation struck deeper than Elizabeth expected. She had been so focused on escaping her past that she hadn't considered what she might be running toward. Living with the Apache had shown her possibilities for existence she had never imagined. A life connected to natural rhythms, built on mutual support and spiritual awareness, rather than social status and material accumulation. Grey Wolf found her later that evening, sitting alone near the edge of camp and staring up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear mountain air. Without the gas lights and coal smoke of Boston, the night sky revealed depths of beauty she had never known existed. "You look troubled," he observed, settling beside her on the rocky outcropping that served as her thinking place. "Not troubled, just thinking about choices," Elizabeth replied. She pulled the finished bracelet from her pouch, its beads catching starlight in tiny flashes of color. "I made this for you." Grey Wolf accepted the gift with reverence, examining the intricate pattern by touch as much as sight. Elizabeth watched his face as he recognized the water design, saw the moment when he understood the significance of her choosing this particular pattern for him. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, tying the bracelet around his wrist. "But more than beautiful, it speaks of understanding." "Understanding of what?" "Of who I am, of what matters to me." Grey Wolf turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the dim starlight. "Elizabeth, there is something I must tell you." The formal tone of his words sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest. "What is it?" "Tomorrow, scouts return from watching soldier movements. If they bring news that cavalry comes close to our territory, the elders will decide to move camp far to south. Women, children, old ones will go first. Warriors stay to fight if necessary. Elizabeth felt her heart sink as she understood the implications. And you would have to stay with the warriors. Yes, but first, they will send you away. Stone Bear already speaks of taking you to trading post where white people can find you safely. I don't want to go to a trading post, Elizabeth said, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. I want to stay here, with you, with these people who have shown me what real community means. Grey Wolf reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. And I want you to stay. But wanting and possible are different things. What if we made them the same thing? Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How? Elizabeth turned to face him, her heart pounding as she prepared to voice thoughts she had barely admitted to herself. What if I chose to become Apache? What if I asked the elders to accept me not as a guest, but as a member of the tribe? Grey Wolf's sharp intake of breath told her she had surprised him completely. Elizabeth, you understand what you ask? To become Apache means leaving White World forever. No return to Boston. No going back to family. What family? Elizabeth asked with bitter laugh. A father who was willing to sell me to a cruel man for business advantage? I have found more caring here in weeks than I knew in years of Eastern society. But your people, your customs. My people are here now, Elizabeth said firmly, gesturing toward the camp where cook fires still glowed like earthbound stars. These are my customs now. Grey Wolf was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if searching for any sign of doubt or romantic delusion. What he found instead was determination born of genuine transformation. The brass buttons gleamed dully in the morning light, scattered among the pine needles like fallen coins. Grey Wolf knelt beside the trail that led to the hidden canyon, his expression grim as he examined the evidence of recent passage. The buttons were regulation U.S. cavalry issue, torn from a uniform during hurried movement through thick brush. How close? Elizabeth asked, though she dreaded the answer. 2 days' ride, maybe less. Grey Wolf pocketed one of the buttons, studying the disturbed earth around their location. Large patrol. 20, maybe 30 soldiers. Elizabeth felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Captain Morrison had found her trail somehow, and he was closing in with enough men to overwhelm any Apache resistance. The peaceful camp where she had begun to find acceptance and purpose was about to become a battlefield because of her presence. We have to warn the others, she said. But Grey Wolf was already moving, leading her swiftly back toward camp through concealed paths that avoided the main trail. The news of approaching soldiers transformed the camp into a hive of urgent activity. Within minutes of Grey Wolf's report, Apache families began the practiced routine of emergency evacuation. Lodges came down with efficient speed, essential supplies were packed on travois, and children who had been playing moments before now helped their mothers prepare for flight. Stone Bear emerged from the council lodge with other senior warriors, his scarred face set in lines of bitter resolve. He strode directly to Elizabeth, holding up one of the cavalry buttons like an accusation. Your soldier comes for you, he said, his English sharp with anger. Just as I warned. Now my people must run like rabbits. I never told him where I was, Elizabeth protested. I don't know how he found me. Does not matter how. Matters only that he comes. Stone Bear's eyes held the cold calculation of a man making life or death decisions. Question now is what we do with you. Elizabeth felt the weight of dozens of stares as Apache families paused in their packing to listen to the confrontation. Children who had begun to trust her now looked at her with confusion and fear. Women who had shared their knowledge stopped their work to watch what judgment would fall on the white woman who had brought danger to their people. Send me away, Elizabeth said, her voice carrying clearly across the camp. Let me go to the soldiers. Tell them you found me wandering and decided to return me for the reward. Grey Wolf stepped forward immediately. No, they will punish you for running away. This Morrison, he is not merciful man. Better that I suffer than your entire people, Elizabeth replied, though the thought of falling into Morrison's hands made her stomach clench with terror. Stone Bear considered her offer, but Bright Moon emerged from the group of women, her weathered face set with determination. This woman heal our wounded, the elder said firmly. She learn our ways, show respect for our customs. Apache do not abandon those who prove themselves worthy. A murmur of agreement rippled through some of the gathered people, but others clearly disagreed. Elizabeth could see the community dividing along lines of pragmatism versus honor, safety versus principle. "Then what you suggest?" Stone Bear demanded. "We test her commitment," Bright Moon replied. "If White Woman truly wished to join Apache people, let her prove it when danger comes." Elizabeth felt Grey Wolf tense beside her, clearly recognizing something in the elder's tone that suggested a specific trial in mind. "What kind of test?" Elizabeth asked, though part of her feared the answer. Bright Moon gestured toward the departing families, then to the warriors preparing for possible battle. "Women and children go south to winter camp. Warriors stay to slow soldiers if they find our trail. You choose which group you join." The challenge was clear and stark. Elizabeth could go with the non-combatants to safety, proving that her commitment to Apache life had limits when real danger threatened. Or she could stay with the warriors, accepting the possibility of capture, torture, or death alongside the men who would defend their people. "If I stay with the warriors, will you accept me as truly Apache?" Elizabeth asked. "If you stay and fight as Apache woman," Stone Bear said slowly, "and if you live through what comes, then yes, you will be one of us." Elizabeth looked around the camp one final time, seeing it through new eyes. These people had shown her kindness when they had every reason for suspicion. They had taught her skills and customs, shared their knowledge and their food, treated her injuries and listened to her stories. Now she had an opportunity to prove that her conversion to their way of life was more than convenience or romantic fantasy. "I stay," she said simply. Grey Wolf's sharp intake of breath told her he had hoped for a different answer, but when she met his eyes, she saw pride along with fear. "Then we prepare for war," Stone Bear declared, "and we see if White Woman truly has Apache heart." As the evacuation continued around them, Elizabeth helped pack medical supplies and weapons, her hands steady despite the terror gnawing at her insides. She had made her choice, and now she would discover whether courage could be learned as easily as beadwork or plant medicine. The brass buttons in Grey Wolf's pouch served as a constant reminder that Morrison was drawing closer with each passing hour, bringing with him not just personal vengeance but the full weight of military might that had crushed Apache resistance for generations. The war paint felt cool and strange against Elizabeth's skin as Bright Moon carefully applied the traditional designs. Red ochre and white clay formed patterns that had protected Apache warriors for generations, symbols of courage, stealth, and spiritual protection that connected the wearer to ancestral power. As the elder woman worked, she explained the meaning of each mark with the solemnity of someone passing down sacred knowledge. "Eagle feather for keen sight," Bright Moon said, drawing curved lines beneath Elizabeth's eyes. "Mountain lion stripes for silent movement. Lightning bolts for speed when danger comes." Elizabeth sat perfectly still, understanding that this ceremony represented more than simple camouflage. The war paint was a visible declaration that she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. When Morrison's soldiers saw her, they would see not a kidnapped white woman but an Apache warrior who had chosen her side in an ancient conflict. Grey Wolf knelt nearby, applying his own paint with practiced efficiency. His grandfather's patterns covered his face and arms, designs that spoke of healing power turned to protection of his people. Elizabeth watched him transform from the gentle man who had carved flutes and shared quiet music into someone harder and more dangerous. "You are afraid?" he asked without looking up from his preparations. "Terrified," Elizabeth admitted, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of failing you, of proving that I'm not strong enough to be Apache." Grey Wolf finally met her eyes, his face now a stark mask of red and black that made his expression unreadable. "Courage is not absence of fear, is choosing right action despite fear." Stone Bear gathered the remaining warriors near the edge of camp as the last of the evacuating families disappeared into the forest. 12 men remained, along with Elizabeth, a force that would be completely overwhelmed if Morrison chose direct assault. Their only advantage lay in knowledge of the terrain and the hope that they could delay pursuit long enough for their people to reach safety. "Soldiers follow main trail," Stone Bear announced, pointing toward the canyon entrance. "We make them think all Apache go that direction. Small groups lead them in circles, make much noise, leave obvious sign. Real trail to winter camp, we hide completely. Elizabeth listened as the warriors divided into teams, each with specific roles in the deception plan. She would accompany Grey Wolf and 2 other men in setting false trails that would lead Morrison's forces away from the true escape route. It was dangerous work that required moving close to enemy patrols while leaving enough evidence to maintain the deception. Remember, Stone Bear concluded, we fight only if trapped. Goal is confusion, not battle. Dead soldiers bring more soldiers. As they prepared to move out, Grey Wolf handed Elizabeth a traditional Apache knife, its bone handle worn smooth by generations of use. The blade was shorter than a cavalry saber but perfectly balanced for close combat or utility work. This belonged to my grandmother, he said quietly. She used it to defend her children when Comanche raided our village many years ago. Now it protects you. Elizabeth accepted the weapon with reverence, understanding the trust Grey Wolf was placing in her. The knife represented not just a tool for survival but a connection to Apache women who had fought to protect their families throughout history. The first day of their deception campaign proceeded according to plan. Elizabeth's team moved through the forest like shadows, leaving carefully placed signs of passage, broken branches, footprints in soft soil, cold fire rings that suggested recent camps. They worked methodically to create the impression of a large group moving slowly toward the eastern passes. Elizabeth discovered that her weeks of training with Bright Moon and the other Apache women had prepared her better than she realized. She moved quietly through undergrowth that would have defeated her months earlier, read the forest signs that indicated safe passage, and maintained the pace that Grey Wolf set without complaint. On the second day, they encountered their first cavalry patrol. Elizabeth's heart hammered as she watched a dozen blue-uniformed soldiers pick their way through the forest below their hidden position. Even at a distance, she recognized Morrison's distinctive profile and the arrogant way he sat his horse. The man who had expected to own her was now hunting her with the focused intensity of a predator. Grey Wolf touched her shoulder and pointed toward a game trail that would allow them to circle around the patrol undetected. But as they began to move, one of the soldiers' horses whinnied and shied, alerting the cavalrymen to possible danger. "Stay here," Grey Wolf whispered, but Elizabeth was already moving, her Apache training taking over despite her terror. She had become someone new during her time in the mountains, not the sheltered Boston socialite who had fled an unwanted marriage, but a woman who could make life-or-death decisions with clarity and resolve. The war paint on her face felt like armor as she followed Grey Wolf deeper into the forest, ready to prove that her commitment to Apache life was more than words. Behind them, Morrison's voice rang out as he organized his men for pursuit, the sound carrying clearly through the thin mountain air. Elizabeth recognized the tone of absolute confidence, the certainty of a man who believed his quarry was finally within reach. He was about to discover how much his former fiancée had changed since leaving Boston. The torn treaty document fluttered against a broken fence post at the abandoned trading post, its official seals and formal language a mockery of the burned buildings surrounding it. Elizabeth stared at the paper as Grey Wolf translated its contents. Promises of peaceful coexistence and mutual respect that had been violated before the ink was dry. Treaty of Medicine Creek, Grey Wolf read aloud, his voice heavy with bitter knowledge. Signed 3 winters ago. Promise Apache people safe passage through traditional hunting grounds in exchange for staying away from white settlements. Elizabeth studied the elaborate signatures and wax seals that had supposedly guaranteed peace between 2 peoples. Captain Morrison's name appeared among the military witnesses, his bold script a reminder that the man pursuing her had been instrumental in creating agreements he never intended to honor. "But the cavalry attacked your village anyway," Elizabeth said, understanding now why the Apache viewed all white promises with deep suspicion. "Always same story," replied Running Fox, one of the warriors accompanying their scouting party. "White men make paper promises, then break them when convenient." The trading post had been abandoned for months. Its owner fled after rumors of renewed Apache hostility made business impossible. Scattered merchandise told the story of hasty evacuation, bolts of cloth torn and soiled, tools left to rust in the mountain weather, barrels of flour burst open and consumed by wildlife. Elizabeth moved through the ruins with growing horror as she recognized the pattern of deliberate destruction. This wasn't the result of Apache raids but of cavalry pacification, the systematic elimination of any neutral ground where Apache and white people might interact peacefully. Morrison did this, she said with sudden certainty, pointing to hoof prints that showed military horses had been present during the destruction. Grey Wolf knelt beside the clearest tracks, studying their depth and spacing. Many soldiers. They burn buildings, destroy goods, then blame Apache for attack. The implications struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. Morrison wasn't just pursuing her out of wounded pride or military duty. He was conducting a campaign of deliberate provocation designed to justify expanded military action against the Apache. Her escape had provided him with the perfect excuse to escalate a conflict that would advance his career while eliminating native resistance to white expansion. "We have to get word to Washington," Elizabeth said urgently. "People need to know what's really happening here." Running Fox laughed bitterly. "White people in Washington already know. They send Morrison to do this work." Elizabeth wanted to argue, to defend her faith in Eastern civilization's moral authority, but the evidence before her made such arguments impossible. The destroyed trading post represented the systematic elimination of peaceful alternatives to conflict, ensuring that violence would be the only option remaining to both sides. As they searched the ruins for anything useful, Elizabeth discovered a strongbox hidden beneath the floorboards of what had been the trader's office. Inside, she found correspondence that painted an even darker picture of Morrison's activities. Letters from territorial officials discussed elimination of the Apache problem and clearing obstacles to mining development with chilling casualness. "Grey Wolf, look at this," she called, holding up a letter dated just weeks before her escape from Boston. He read the document with growing anger, his jaw tightening as he absorbed its contents. The letter outlined plans for provoking Apache attacks that would justify massive military retaliation, including specific instructions for destroying neutral trading posts and blaming the destruction on Indian raiders. "They planned this for a long time," Grey Wolf said finally. "You're running away, just give them excuse to move faster." Elizabeth felt a crushing weight of guilt settle on her shoulders. Her personal rebellion against an unwanted marriage had inadvertently provided cover for genocide. Morrison's pursuit of her wasn't separate from his campaign against the Apache. It was an integral part of a larger strategy to eliminate any possibility of peaceful coexistence. "What have I done?" she whispered, staring at the evidence of systematic deception and betrayal. "You not do this," Grey Wolf said firmly. "Evil men do this. You just caught in their web." But Elizabeth understood now why some Apache warriors viewed her presence as a curse rather than a blessing. She represented not just personal danger but the embodiment of white civilization's fundamental dishonesty. Every kindness she had received from Apache people had been given despite their knowledge that her race was actively working to destroy them. Running Fox emerged from another building carrying a repeating rifle and several boxes of ammunition, military supplies that confirmed the trading post's role as a weapons depot for Morrison's forces. "Now we know why soldiers destroy this place," he said grimly. "Hide evidence of government guns going to militia groups." The picture was becoming clearer with each discovery. Morrison had been using the trading post to arm civilian militias who would attack Apache settlements, then claiming the attacks were defensive actions by innocent settlers. The Apache retaliation would then justify massive military intervention that would drive the tribes from lands wanted by mining companies and railroad developers. Elizabeth realized she was looking at the blueprint for cultural extinction disguised as law enforcement. The treaty document blowing in the wind wasn't just broken paper. It was evidence of a deliberate strategy to make peace impossible while maintaining the appearance of legal authority. "We have to stop him," she said, her voice carrying new resolve. "How?" Grey Wolf asked. "We are few. He has army." Elizabeth studied the documents in her hands, understanding finally that her value to the Apache people went beyond medical knowledge or cultural bridge building. She possessed something Morrison couldn't afford to let fall into the wrong hands: first-hand knowledge of his plans and the documentary evidence to prove his deception. "We expose him," she said simply. "We make sure these papers reach people who can't be bought or intimidated." Elizabeth's mother's ring caught the firelight as she turned it slowly between her fingers, the familiar weight of the emerald and gold band carrying memories of a life that now seemed to belong to someone else entirely. She sat alone at the edge of their hidden camp, wrestling with a decision that would define not just her future, but her very identity. The ring had been her mother's most treasured possession, passed down through 3 generations of Whitmore women who had worn it as a symbol of their place in Boston society. Elizabeth had worn it every day since her mother's death, finding comfort in its tangible connection to the woman who had raised her with gentle wisdom and quiet strength. Now, staring at the elegant piece of jewelry that marked her as a child of privilege and Eastern refinement, Elizabeth understood that keeping it meant holding onto a part of herself that no longer existed. The woman who had fled Boston in a torn wedding dress was gone, replaced by someone who could move silently through Apache territory and tend wounded warriors with steady hands. Gray Wolf approached quietly, settling beside her without speaking. He had learned to recognize her moods, understanding when she needed silence and when she needed conversation. Tonight, as she contemplated the final severing of ties to her old life, his presence provided an anchor to the new identity she was still building. "It was my mother's," Elizabeth said softly, holding the ring up to catch the starlight. "The only thing I brought from Boston that actually mattered to me." Gray Wolf examined the ring without touching it, respecting both its obvious value and its emotional significance. "Beautiful," he said simply. "But you think of leaving it behind." "Stone Bear is right to question my commitment," Elizabeth admitted. "As long as I carry pieces of my old life, part of me will always be looking backward instead of forward." "And you want to look forward?" Elizabeth turned to face him fully, searching his expression for any sign of doubt or reservation. "I want to look forward with you, but I need to know that you believe I'm truly choosing this life, not just running from the other one." Gray Wolf was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the ring to her face and back again. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. "When I was boy, after soldiers killed my family, I carry my father's war club everywhere. Think it make me strong like him, keep his spirit close to mine." Gray Wolf gestured toward the darkness beyond their camp. "But grandfather tell me that carrying dead man's weapons make me live in past, not present. Say I must make my own weapons, find my own strength." Elizabeth understood the parallel he was drawing, but the thought of discarding her mother's ring still felt like betrayal of everything the older woman had represented. "What did you do?" "I bury war club beside my father's grave. Tell his spirit I love him but cannot carry his battles anymore. Must fight my own wars, make my own peace." The simple wisdom of his words resonated through Elizabeth's confusion, offering clarity she hadn't been able to find on her own. Her mother would have wanted her to be happy and free, not trapped by memories of a world that had tried to cage her spirit. "If I let go of this ring," Elizabeth said slowly, "I let go of the last connection to the woman who raised me." "No," Gray Wolf replied firmly. "You carry her love inside you. Ring is just metal and stone. Love is something that cannot be taken or lost." Elizabeth felt tears sting her eyes as she recognized the truth in his words. Her mother's love had shaped her capacity for compassion, her strength in adversity, her ability to find joy in simple pleasures. Those qualities had enabled her to survive in the wilderness and earn acceptance among people her upbringing had taught her to fear. Standing slowly, Elizabeth walked to the edge of a steep ravine that dropped away into darkness. She held the ring for one final moment, remembering her mother's gentle hands and wise counsel, then opened her fingers and let it fall into the void below. The tiny sound of metal striking stone far below seemed to echo through her entire being, marking the moment when Elizabeth Whitmore of Boston ceased to exist entirely. What remained was someone new, a woman who belonged neither to the world of her birth nor fully to her adopted people, but to something in between that she would have to create for herself. When she returned to Gray Wolf's side, she felt lighter somehow, as if shedding the ring had freed her from weights she hadn't even realized she was carrying. "Now what?" she asked. "Now you are truly free to choose," Gray Wolf replied. "Not running from old life, but running toward new one." Elizabeth reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with a sense of decision that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Then I choose you. I choose this life, these people, this way of being in the world. Grey Wolf brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. And I choose you, not white woman trying to be Apache, but Elizabeth who is herself, something new. As they returned to the warmth of their small camp, Elizabeth felt the future opening before them like an unexplored trail. There would be dangers ahead, Morrison's pursuit, the challenges of building a life between two worlds, the ongoing struggle for Apache survival. But for the first time since leaving Boston, she faced those challenges without looking over her shoulder at the life she had abandoned. The ring was gone, but the love it had represented remained, transformed into something that could flourish in the harsh beauty of her chosen homeland. The ceremonial wedding blanket spread across Elizabeth's shoulders felt heavier than any garment she had ever worn, its weight coming not from the wool and intricate weaving but from the profound significance of acceptance it represented. Bright Moon and 3 other Apache women had worked for days to complete the traditional design, their fingers flying through patterns that told stories of unity, protection, and the joining of 2 lives into one harmonious whole. Elizabeth stood at the center of the winter camp, surrounded by Apache families who had gathered to witness what many considered an unprecedented event. A white woman was being formally adopted into the tribe, not as a curiosity or temporary guest, but as a full member with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. Today, we welcome new daughter, announced White Eagle, the eldest of the tribal council. His weathered face carried the authority of someone who had guided his people through decades of change and challenge. She proved herself in battle, in healing, in learning our ways. Now she becomes Apache in truth, not just in heart. The ceremony had begun at dawn with purification rituals that cleansed Elizabeth of her former identity. Apache women had bathed her in water blessed with sacred herbs, painted new symbols on her face that marked her rebirth, and dressed her in clothing created specifically for this transformation. Every element of the process had been designed to honor both her old life and her new one. Grey Wolf stood nearby, his face serious but glowing with pride as he watched Elizabeth accept the formal recognition he had hoped for but never dared expect. The tribal council had debated for hours about the wisdom of adopting a white woman during a time of increasing conflict with the cavalry. Some argued that her presence would bring only trouble. Others insisted that her courage and commitment had earned her a place among them. The wedding blanket itself told the story of Elizabeth's journey through its carefully chosen symbols. At the center, a white star represented her origins in the distant east. Surrounding it, mountain patterns showed her passage into Apache territory, while flowing water designs depicted the cleansing trials she had undergone. The border was worked in the pattern of joined hands, symbolizing the unity between her new Apache family and the love she shared with Grey Wolf. "Speak the words of acceptance," White Eagle instructed, offering Elizabeth a bundle of sage that smoldered with sweet-scented smoke. Elizabeth had memorized the Apache phrases during weeks of preparation, but now she spoke them with understanding that went far beyond mere pronunciation. "I cast aside my old name and old ways. I accept the wisdom of the Apache people as my wisdom, their customs as my customs, their enemies as my enemies, their children as my children." As she spoke each phrase, she touched the burning sage to different parts of the blanket, sealing her commitment with the sacred smoke that would carry her words to the spirit world. The watching crowd murmured approval as her pronunciation proved accurate and her demeanor demonstrated genuine reverence for the traditions she was embracing. Bright Moon stepped forward with a small pouch of earth that had been gathered from significant Apache sites throughout their traditional territory. "This is the land of your people now," she said, pouring a small amount of the dark soil into Elizabeth's cupped hands. "Carry it with you always, so you never forget where you belong." Elizabeth accepted the earth with trembling fingers, understanding that she held in her hands the physical essence of her new homeland. The soil came from places where Apache children had been born, where warriors had died defending their families, where generations of her adopted people had lived and loved and struggled to survive. "What name do you choose for your new life?" White Eagle asked. Elizabeth had given this question careful thought, wanting a name that honored both her transformation and her relationship with the man who had saved her life. "Singing Water," she replied. using the Apache words Gray Wolf had taught her. Because music brought Gray Wolf and me together, and water cleanses the spirit for new beginnings. The gathered Apache murmured approval at her choice. Singing Water was a name that spoke of harmony and renewal, qualities they had observed in the white woman who had learned to heal with Apache medicines and moved silently through their mountain homeland. White Eagle raised his voice to address the entire gathering. Let it be known that the woman who was called Elizabeth is no more. In her place stands Singing Water, daughter of the Apache people, sister to our daughters, protector of our children. As the formal ceremony concluded, Apache families approached to welcome their new member with gifts and words of acceptance. Children who had initially viewed her with suspicion now offered small tokens of friendship, carved animals, woven grass dolls, strings of polished seeds that represented their willingness to include her in their games and trust. Elizabeth felt overwhelmed by the generosity of people who had every reason to reject her, but had chosen instead to embrace her completely. The wedding blanket around her shoulders no longer felt like a foreign garment, but like armor woven from acceptance and love. Gray Wolf approached as the crowd began to disperse, his eyes bright with emotion as he looked at the woman who was now truly his equal in every way that mattered to Apache society. Singing Water, he said, testing her new name with obvious pleasure. It suits you perfectly. And you? She replied, reaching up to touch his face with fingers still dusty from the ceremonial earth. Are the reason I found my true voice. The blood-stained cavalry guidon fluttered from a broken lance thrust into the ground at the entrance to Bear Canyon, its blue silk and gold tassels a grim herald of the massive military force advancing toward the Apache winter stronghold. Running Fox had brought the captured standard back from his scouting mission, along with news that made every warrior's face grow grave with understanding of what was coming. For companies of cavalry, Running Fox reported to the assembled war council. Maybe 200 soldiers, plus civilian militia and Apache scouts from the reservation. Singing Water felt her blood chill at the mention of Apache scouts. Morrison had managed to recruit some of her adopted people to hunt their own kind, using threats and promises to divide families that had survived together for generations. How long before they reach us? White Eagle asked, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of the threat they faced. 2 days if they follow main trail, less if they know about hidden passes. Stone Bear examined the guidon with the eye of someone who had fought cavalry forces before and understood their tactics. This is 3rd Colorado Regiment, Morrison's unit. They not come just to recover White Woman, they come to finish Apache people forever. The captured standard confirmed what Singing Water had feared since discovering Morrison's correspondence at the trading post. Her former fiancé wasn't conducting a rescue mission but a campaign of extermination disguised as law enforcement. The guidon represented not just military authority but Morrison's personal obsession with proving his dominance over anyone who dared defy him. We cannot fight so many, admitted Gray Wolf, his tactical assessment carrying no shame, only realistic evaluation of their situation. But we can make them pay high price for victory. Singing Water studied the faces around the council fire, seeing the resignation of people who had fought this battle many times before. The Apache had survived by being pragmatic about impossible odds, choosing when to fight and when to fade into the wilderness like smoke on the wind. What if we don't have to fight them all at once? She asked quietly. Stone Bear's scarred features twisted into a skeptical frown. What you mean? Morrison is here because of me. If I surrender myself, would he withdraw his forces? The suggestion sparked immediate protest from Gray Wolf and several other warriors, but White Eagle raised his hand for silence. The old chief studied Singing Water with eyes that had seen too many good people sacrifice themselves for temporary peace. You think this Morrison would honor such bargain? White Eagle asked. No, Singing Water admitted. But I think his officers might question orders to attack a peaceful camp if their stated objective was already achieved. Running Fox shook his head grimly. Soldiers not come this far to turn back empty-handed. They want to show Apache people what happens to those who resist white authority. As the council debated options that ranged from desperate to impossible, Singing Water found herself studying the captured guidon with growing understanding of its tactical significance. The standard wasn't just a symbol. It was a communication device that other military units would recognize and respect. In the wrong hands, it could create confusion among Morrison's scattered forces. "The Gaiden," she said suddenly, interrupting a heated exchange about defensive positions. "What if we used it to send false signals to the other cavalry units?" Stone Bear's eyes lit with predatory interest. "Continue. Morrison has divided his forces to search multiple canyons. If we could use their own signals to misdirect some of those units, we could face smaller groups instead of the entire army." Grey Wolf leaned forward, his tactical mind already working through the possibilities. "Dangerous plan. If discovered, would make them even more angry. They're already planning to kill us all," Singing Water pointed out. "What do we have to lose by trying to divide their forces?" White Eagle considered the proposal with the careful deliberation of someone who had led his people through decades of survival against overwhelming odds. The plan carried enormous risks, but it also offered the first real hope of inflicting significant casualties on Morrison's expedition. "You understand cavalry signals?" Stone Bear asked. "I attended enough military functions in Boston to learn basic flag communications," Singing Water replied. "And Morrison was always eager to demonstrate his tactical knowledge to impress me." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The very arrogance that had made Morrison explain military procedures to his unwilling fiancée might now provide the knowledge needed to turn his own forces against each other. "If we try this, and it fails, they will show no mercy," White Eagle warned. "They'll show no mercy anyway," Singing Water replied. "At least this way we might save some of our people." As the council made their final decision, Singing Water felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders. She had become more than Grey Wolf's beloved or an adopted Apache daughter. She was now a war leader whose tactical knowledge might determine whether her people lived or died. The blood on the captured Gaiden had dried to a dark brown stain that spoke of violence already committed. Soon, she would discover whether her plan could prevent more Apache blood from joining it, or whether Morrison's superior numbers would overwhelm any clever deception she could devise. Outside the council lodge, the winter wind carried the scent of snow and the distant sound of horses moving through the mountains. Morrison was coming, bringing with him the full weight of military authority and personal vengeance. But he would find that his former fiancée had learned lessons in the wilderness that no Boston finishing school had ever taught. The white flag fluttered against the morning sky like a surrender, but Singing Water knew it represented something far more dangerous than capitulation. She had torn the fabric from her own petticoat, the last remnant of her Eastern clothing, transforming it into a symbol that might buy precious time for her people or might lead to her own destruction. Grey Wolf checked the knots securing the flag to a sturdy pine branch, his movements betraying the tension he was trying to hide. "You still have time to change your mind," he said quietly. "Stone Bear can find another way." "There is no other way," Singing Water replied, adjusting the Apache war paint on her face that marked her as a negotiator protected by ancient customs. "Morrison will listen to me because his pride demands the chance to gloat over his victory." The plan was desperate but simple. Singing Water would approach Morrison's main force under a flag of truce, ostensibly to negotiate surrender terms that would protect the Apache civilians. In reality, she hoped to create enough confusion and delay to allow Grey Wolf and the other warriors to execute their diversionary attacks on the scattered cavalry units. "Remember," Grey Wolf said, his voice tight with worry, "you are Apache now. If Morrison tries to claim you as his property, you have right to refuse." Singing Water nodded, though they both understood that Morrison's respect for Apache customs would extend only as far as his immediate tactical needs. Once he had her in custody, any pretense of civilized behavior would likely disappear. As she prepared to leave the hidden canyon, Singing Water felt the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment. The scared Boston socialite who had fled into the wilderness would never have imagined herself walking deliberately into enemy hands to protect people she had learned to love more than her own life. The approach to Morrison's camp took her through terrain she had learned to read like a book during her months with the Apache. She moved carefully through the pine forests and rocky outcroppings, noting the positions of sentries and the deployment of cavalry units with eyes trained by warriors who had survived decades of conflict. Morrison had established his command post in a meadow that offered clear fields of fire but left his forces exposed to the kind of guerrilla tactics the Apache had perfected. His confidence in overwhelming numbers had made him careless about defensive positioning, a weakness that Grey Wolf intended to exploit. The first cavalry patrol spotted her when she was still a quarter-mile from the main camp. Singing Water raised the white flag high and called out in English, identifying herself as a negotiator seeking safe passage to speak with Captain Morrison. The soldiers' reactions told her everything she needed to know about their commander's state of mind. They were nervous, trigger-happy, and clearly expecting treachery from any Apache contact. "Hold your fire!" shouted a sergeant as younger soldiers reached for their weapons. "That's a flag of truce." Singing Water walked steadily forward, her heart hammering against her ribs, as she fought to project the calm confidence of someone arriving for routine diplomatic discussions. The white flag felt impossibly fragile in her hands, a thin barrier between herself and the rifles aimed in her direction. Morrison emerged from his command tent before she reached the camp perimeter, his familiar figure stirring complex emotions she had hoped were buried forever. He looked older than she remembered, his face marked by the harsh conditions of frontier service and the cold ambition that had always driven him toward promotion and recognition. "Elizabeth Whitmore," he called out, his voice carrying across the meadow with the tone of ownership she remembered so well. Or should I say, the Apache squaw who used to be Elizabeth Whitmore? The insult was calculated to provoke anger that might make her careless. But Singing Water had learned patience from people who had survived by controlling their emotions under extreme pressure. She continued walking at a steady pace, neither hurrying nor hesitating, until she reached the informal boundary marked by Morrison's personal guards. "Captain Morrison," she replied formally, stopping just outside rifle range and maintaining the white flag's visibility. "I come under protection of truce customs to discuss terms for ending this conflict without unnecessary bloodshed." Morrison's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally cornered his prey. "The only terms I'm interested in discussing involve your immediate surrender and the location of the Apache war camp." "I'm prepared to surrender myself," Singing Water said carefully, "in exchange for your guarantee that no military action will be taken against the Apache families in this region." "You're hardly in a position to negotiate conditions," Morrison replied, gesturing toward the soldiers surrounding the meadow. "I have enough men to hunt down every Apache in these mountains if necessary." "But you don't have enough men to do it without heavy casualties," Singing Water observed. "And your superiors in Washington might ask uncomfortable questions about a campaign that results in significant military losses to recover one runaway bride." Morrison's expression darkened as he recognized the tactical challenge hidden within her words. He had built his reputation on efficient operations that achieved maximum results with minimal cost. A prolonged campaign that produced heavy casualties would damage his prospects for advancement regardless of its ultimate success. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, his tone shifting from mockery to grudging interest. Singing Water raised the white flag higher, knowing that Grey Wolf would be watching from concealment and waiting for the signal that would begin their desperate gamble with time and Morrison's pride. Grey Wolf's father's war lance felt cold and familiar in his hands as he crept through the pine shadows toward Morrison's eastern flank, its obsidian point honed to razor sharpness for the battle that would determine his people's survival. The weapon had been passed down through 3 generations of Apache warriors, each adding their own medicine marks to the ashwood shaft until it carried the accumulated power of his entire lineage. From his concealed position, Grey Wolf could see Singing Water standing in the meadow below, her white flag still raised as she faced Morrison with courage that made his heart swell with pride and terror in equal measure. The woman he loved was risking everything to give him and the other warriors the time they needed to execute their desperate plan. Stone Bear's signal came as a hawk's cry echoing across the canyon. The attack on Morrison's supply wagons had begun successfully. Grey Wolf gripped the war lance tighter and began his own advance, moving with the fluid stealth his grandfather had taught him during childhood hunts that now served deadlier purposes. The first cavalry sentry never saw him coming. Grey Wolf's approach from downwind, combined with the distraction of Singing Water's negotiations, allowed him to reach striking distance before the young soldier realized death was upon him. The lance point found the gap between neck and collar, ending the threat silently and efficiently. Grey Wolf pulled the body into concealment and continued toward his primary objective, Morrison's communication station, where flag signals coordinated the scattered cavalry units. If he could disrupt those communications while Stone Bear's diversionary attacks created chaos elsewhere, Morrison's superior numbers would become a liability rather than an advantage. The second sentry proved more alert, turning at the last moment with his rifle half-raised before Grey Wolf's lance took him in the chest. The dying man's cry of alarm echoed across the meadow, alerting Morrison's forces that the Apache had brought the fight to them despite the ongoing truce negotiations. "We're under attack!" shouted a sergeant, rallying the scattered soldiers as Apache war cries erupted from multiple directions around the valley. Grey Wolf could see Morrison's fury as the captain realized he had been outmaneuvered by his former fiancée's tactical deception. The white flag had been genuine protection for negotiations, but it had also provided cover for Apache warriors to move into striking positions around the cavalry camp. Racing toward the communication post, Grey Wolf dodged rifle fire from soldiers who were trying to organize a defense against attacks coming from 3 directions simultaneously. Stone Bear's assault on the supply train had drawn significant forces away from the main camp, while Running Fox's raids on the horse lines had created panic among cavalrymen who suddenly found themselves facing combat on foot. The war lance that had served his father and grandfather became an extension of Grey Wolf's own will as he fought through Morrison's defensive perimeter. Each thrust of the obsidian point carried not just his personal determination but the accumulated rage of his people against decades of broken promises and systematic betrayal. At the communication station, Grey Wolf found 2 soldiers frantically trying to send flag signals to the scattered cavalry units. The war lance took the first man cleanly, while the second managed to draw his pistol before Grey Wolf's follow-up strike ended his resistance. Within moments, the Apache warrior was sending his own signals using the captured cavalry guidon, directing Morrison's scattered forces toward empty canyons where they would waste precious time searching for enemies who weren't there. The sound of approaching hooves warned Grey Wolf that Morrison himself was leading a counterattack toward the communication post. Through the trees, he could see the captain riding hard with a dozen mounted soldiers, his saber drawn and his face twisted with the kind of rage that made men dangerous beyond their normal capabilities. Grey Wolf positioned himself behind the communication station's log walls, the war lance ready for the close combat that would decide whether his deception had bought enough time for the Apache families to reach safety. The weapon felt alive in his hands, thrumming with the spirits of warriors who had wielded it in defense of their people across generations of conflict. Morrison's charge brought him into the clearing at full gallop, his horse's hooves throwing up clods of earth as he drove straight toward Grey Wolf's position with the reckless courage of a man who had never experienced defeat. The captain's saber gleamed in the morning sunlight as he raised it for a killing stroke that would end both the Apache resistance and his personal humiliation. But Grey Wolf was no longer the grieving boy whose family had been murdered by cavalrymen like Morrison. He was a warrior whose skills had been honed by years of survival in the unforgiving wilderness, whose tactical knowledge had been earned through battles against enemies who gave no quarter and expected none. The war lance met Morrison's charge with the precision of a master craftsman using a perfectly balanced tool. The obsidian point found the gap in the captain's defenses just as it had found the gaps in his sentry's protection, driving through uniform and flesh with the accumulated force of 3 generations of Apache resistance. Morrison's saber fell from nerveless fingers as he toppled from his horse, his expression shifting from fury to shock to the growing understanding that his career of Indian fighting had finally brought him face to face with a warrior his equal in both skill and determination. The peace pipe lay between the 2 groups like a bridge spanning an impossible divide, its carved stone bowl still warm from the sacred tobacco that had sealed an agreement none of the participants had expected to survive. The morning's violence. Captain Morrison sat propped against a pine tree, his wound bandaged with Apache medicines while his remaining soldiers watched their former enemies with the wary respect that follows close combat. Grey Wolf had spared Morrison's life in a moment of decision that surprised everyone present, including himself. The war lance that could have ended the captain's existence instead delivered a disabling wound that left him alive to witness the complete failure of his campaign. Sometimes, Grey Wolf reflected, living with defeat carried more weight than dying heroically. Singing water moved between the wounded men of both sides, her medical knowledge serving Apache and cavalry alike without distinction. Her hands, stained with blood from a dozen different patients, worked with the steady competence of someone who had learned to value life over the artificial divisions that set people against each other. "Why?" Morrison asked through gritted teeth as she cleaned his wound with practiced efficiency. "Why spare me when you had every right to kill me?" "Because death would have been too easy," Grey Wolf replied, settling beside them with the deliberate care of someone whose own injuries were catching up with him. "Better that you live to explain to your superiors how Apache savages defeated a force 3 times their size." The battle had lasted less than 2 hours, but its outcome had reversed the balance of power in the entire region. Morrison's scattered forces, confused by false signals and divided by terrain they didn't understand, had been defeated piecemeal by Apache warriors who used their knowledge of the mountains to deadly advantage. Lieutenant Hayes, the highest-ranking officer still capable of command, approached the informal gathering with the careful movements of someone trying to prevent further bloodshed. The young man's face bore the shell-shocked expression of someone whose certainties about civilization and savagery had been shattered by morning's brutal education. "Captain Morrison is unable to continue command," Hayes announced formally. "As senior officer, I'm prepared to discuss terms for the withdrawal of federal forces from this territory." Stone Bear, despite wounds that would have felled a lesser man, rose to respond with the dignity of someone who had earned the right to negotiate from strength. "Apache people want only to live in peace on land of our ancestors. We make no war on white settlements that respect our boundaries." The peace pipe had belonged to White Eagle's grandfather, a chief who had tried unsuccessfully to negotiate lasting peace with American forces during the early days of westward expansion. Now it served a purpose its creator had dreamed of but never achieved, creating genuine understanding between peoples who had been taught to see each other as irredeemable enemies. "What about her?" Lieutenant Hayes asked, indicating Singing Water with obvious confusion about her status in the negotiations. "She is Apache," Stone Bear replied firmly. "Adopted daughter of our people, wife of Grey Wolf, healer of our wounded. Her place is with us." Morrison's laugh carried bitter recognition of his complete defeat. "Elizabeth Whitmore died in these mountains, didn't she? What remains is someone I never understood and could never have controlled." Singing Water looked up from her patient care to meet Morrison's eyes with the calm assurance of someone who had found her true identity through trials he could never comprehend. "You're right about that, James. The woman you intended to marry was a creation of other people's expectations. I had to lose everything I thought I was to discover who I actually am." The formal negotiations continued through the afternoon, with both sides working to establish boundaries that might prevent future conflicts. Lieutenant Hayes proved more flexible than his predecessor, perhaps because he had witnessed firsthand the cost of Morrison's aggressive policies. The Apache, for their part, offered guarantees about safe passage for travelers and traders who respected their territorial claims. As the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, the surviving cavalry forces prepared to withdraw under terms that preserved their honor while acknowledging Apache sovereignty over their traditional lands. It wasn't the complete victory either side had imagined, but it was something more valuable, a genuine agreement based on mutual respect rather than superior force. "You realize this won't last," Morrison said quietly as Singing Water finished tending his wounds. "Washington will send more troops, more commanders like me who see Indians as obstacles to progress." "Perhaps," Grey Wolf acknowledged, "but some of those commanders will remember what happened here. They'll remember that Apache people can be honorable enemies and trustworthy allies when treated with respect." Singing Water helped Morrison to his feet, supporting his weight as he prepared to join his retreating forces. Despite everything he had done and tried to do, she felt no hatred for the man who had inadvertently led her to her true home. "Take care of yourself, James," she said simply, "and try to remember that strength isn't always about domination." As the cavalry column disappeared into the forest, Singing Water stood beside Grey Wolf and watched the shadows lengthen across the meadow where their two worlds had finally found a way to coexist. The peace pipe between them represented more than a temporary truce. It embodied the possibility that understanding could triumph over fear when people chose courage over prejudice. The mountains that had witnessed so much violence now stood as silent guardians over a fragile but genuine peace, their ancient wisdom finally validated by people wise enough to choose healing over hatred. The child's cradle rocked gently in the morning breeze, its carved wooden sides telling the story of a family that had found love across the deepest of cultural divides. Grey Wolf had spent months creating the intricate piece, working by firelight during the long winter evenings while Singing Water's pregnancy progressed, and their Apache community prepared to welcome its newest member. 1 year had passed since the battle that ended Morrison's campaign and established the fragile peace between Apache territory and the expanding white settlements. The cradle bore symbols from both worlds, Apache designs that would protect the child from harm, and musical notes that honored the melodies that had first brought its parents together. Singing Water sat in the doorway of their lodge, nursing their 3-month-old daughter while watching the spring activities of a camp that had grown considerably since news of the peace agreement spread among scattered Apache bands. Families who had spent years hiding in remote canyons had returned to traditional gathering places, bringing with them children who could now learn their heritage without constant fear of cavalry raids. "She has your eyes," Grey Wolf observed, settling beside his wife with the easy contentment of a man who had found his place in the world. "But I think she will have Apache stubbornness." "God help us all," Singing Water laughed, adjusting the soft deerskin blanket that wrapped their daughter. They had named her Dawn Singer, honoring both the time of day she had been born and her mother's musical heritage that had bridged two peoples. The past year had brought changes none of them could have anticipated when they first faced Morrison's overwhelming force. The treaty negotiated in the aftermath of the battle had held, largely because Lieutenant Hayes had proven to be an honorable man who kept his word, even when pressured by superiors who preferred military solutions to diplomatic ones. Singing Water had played a crucial role in maintaining the peace, serving as an interpreter and cultural bridge between Apache representatives and government officials who came to renegotiate territorial boundaries. Her unique position as someone who truly belonged to both worlds allowed her to explain each side's concerns in terms the other could understand. "The trader brings news from the east," Grey Wolf said, nodding toward a dust cloud that marked an approaching wagon train. Samuel Martinez had become a regular visitor to their camp, one of the few white men trusted to bring supplies and news without hidden agendas or military connections. Martinez arrived with his usual collection of trade goods and gossip, but also with letters that bore official seals and formal language. Singing Water accepted the correspondence with hands that no longer trembled at reminders of her former life. "Word from Washington," Martinez explained as she examined the documents. "Seems your peace treaty has impressed some important people. They're talking about establishing a permanent Indian agency here, with you as the official liaison." Singing Water studied the formal offer of government employment, recognizing both the opportunity and the dangers it represented. Official recognition would provide resources for her people but also bring closer scrutiny from authorities who might have different ideas about how to manage Indian affairs. "What do you think?" she asked Grey Wolf, whose opinion mattered more than any government position. "I think you already do this work," he replied thoughtfully. "Question is whether white man's paper makes it better or worse." The decision wasn't difficult. Singing Water had learned to trust her instincts over the past year, developing judgment that combined Apache wisdom with her Eastern education. She would accept the position but on terms that preserved her people's autonomy while providing them with legal protection they had never enjoyed before. As evening approached, the extended family gathered around their fire to hear Martinez's news and share their own stories of the year's developments. Children who had been born during the conflict now played together in the firelight, their laughter carrying hopes for a future where such divisions might become merely historical curiosities. Dawn Singer stirred in her mother's arms, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames as if already seeing possibilities that her parents' generation had fought to create. In her small face, Singing Water saw the future of two peoples learning to live as neighbors rather than enemies. "Tell me again about the frozen woman," requested Little Fox, one of the Apache children who had become fascinated by Singing Water's origin story. "Once upon a time," Singing Water began, settling into the familiar rhythm of storytelling that had become one of her favorite duties as the camp's bridge between worlds. "There was a woman who thought she knew who she was, until winter taught her that sometimes you have to lose everything to find your true home." As the story unfolded around the fire, Gray Wolf carved new symbols into the cradle's headboard, designs that would remind Dawn Singer of her heritage from both parents and the love that had overcome seemingly impossible obstacles to bring her into being. The mountains stood silent witness to another ending that was also a beginning, their ancient patience finally rewarded by people wise enough to choose understanding over conflict. In the carved cradle that rocked gently beside the fire, the future slept peacefully, protected by love that had proven stronger than prejudice and hope that had survived the worst that fear could devise.